Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Eduonix Technologies. In this lecture I'm just going to be going over the introduction to Photoshop, what Photoshop is, what makes it different, what you use it for. And this is especially important because a lot of people have begun using Photoshop as a go-to for any kind of graphic needs, particularly things that aren't things like graphic design, things that aren't photo editing directly. They use it for vector illustrations, um, but based on its tools, it's just not ideal for that. Even InDesign is better. I copied this from Wikipedia. If you just Google Photoshop on Wikipedia, you'll get this page. And it's the gist of the history and everything about it. It's kind of interesting if you're into software. I'm not going to read over it, but if you want to go to it, that's where it is. What I'm going to be using for the length of this tutorial is Photoshop CC, and I'll use 2014 every once in a while. CC is the most recent version as of February 2014. It was meant to replace Photoshop Creative Suite and just kind of created its own little product in doing so. It's basically the exact same as CS, but I'll point out the differences in the videos. If I don't point them out as such, then you'll see the differences if you have a CS product. So the first thing I'll go into is what makes Photoshop different from Illustrator. So right here I just went over to Illustrator. If you'd watched the other series, you'd probably have a good idea of what this is. As you can see, this in Illustrator is just a series of points and lines. There's a vector object. It's math that's telling the computer what to make it look like. Now you can just drag things straight from Illustrator into Photoshop, and it'll place them in the form of a smart object. And you can change whether or not it pastes it as pixels or a smart object. So they're pretty much interchangeable as far as Photoshop and Illustrator, but we'll have a video specifically on that. Photoshop's meant for editing pixels, and Illustrator's meant for exact approximation of an image through points and math and coordinates. It's a little clunkier to use than Photoshop generally for drawing, if you have a graphics tablet especially. Those file differences are like AI, EPS, SVG for Illustrator, and PSD, JPEG, any of the raster image formats for Photoshop. I can show you what I'm talking about here with a little bit more with the difference. What we have here is a finite amount of information because the pixels are basically being plotted out by the software, by the algorithm. Whereas if you get up, and and typically we would trace over this image in Illustrator, but just an example of how to get vector information. I ran an auto trace here. Now it's editable. It's a 2-color. You could find the amount of colors in the illustration and then do it out that way. It's about like 5 or 6, it looks like. Count them all up, including white and black. And but yeah, Illustrator has a lot of tools for working with vectors, so that's going to be the main difference here. Photoshop has a lot of tools with working directly with pixels, and that's the key word, I think, is directly. As you can see here, I'm just taking out this, and you can see how cleanly you can do it. You can't really do that with Illustrator as well. unless you did what I just showed you, that breaking it up into its colors. And I'm using a pen tab for most of these, so a lot of these at least, and if you have one, I suggest using it with Photoshop if you haven't already. There's a lot of brushes, whereas in Illustrator they don't have brushes per se. They have brush presets and things, or they have brushes that kind of spray paint for symbols. So as you can see, this works really well with a Wacom brush. I can get a lot of different textures. Your textures or your brushes may not look a lot like this if you don't have the different pressure, rotation, sensitivities that pen tabs have. In Photoshop you can do a lot of things you can't do with Illustrator, like change colors here, and you can do that with Illustrator, but it's a whole different beast over in Photoshop. And a few more differences. So this would be an example of how to change colors in Photoshop, whereas how to change colors in Illustrator usually involves the edit colors dialog, if you want to change them all at once, that is. In Photoshop there's adjustments, and even though I did it this way, there's adjustment layers, which is a little bit better way of doing it. Let's say Illustrator is a more permanent version than Photoshop, though. Even though what you're doing in Photoshop is pixels, Illustrator is a fully customizable. So like the selections are definitely the most different part about Illustrator and Photoshop and what a selection means. The thing to know is that Photoshop's main use is in raster editing, and Illustrator's is in vector editing, and knowing what all of the extrapolations of that mean. So take some time and study this diagram. Now, when you have a raster image, use Photoshop, and when you have a vector image, use Illustrator. And you'll see a lot of that in the similarities over here. Another thing to note is you'll get a better feel for this as we go along. The top three are similar on both sides, so the top three on Photoshop and Illustrator in this diagram, they describe the uses, and the ones below them describe the tools, and they kind of correspond between the two areas. For example, this layer tool is layer dependent. In Photoshop it's not. Another difference that you don't see here is that Photoshop you use layers a lot more. In Illustrator you don't use them as much. Photoshop is reading pixel information and interpreting it directly, and Illustrator is basically, like I said before, it's reading points and coordinates and math, and it's telling you everything specifically about how to construct the image. And while that doesn't mean anything in the end result as much as it means something in how you go about creating the image. So most people will agree that Photoshop is a lot more fun. In Illustrator you have usually an almost infinite amount of history states, where you can see here in Photoshop that I have I'm limited to about 25 or so, about 20 looks like. But then again, Photoshop has like history brush options, whereas Illustrator wouldn't really make sense to have that. And you'll understand that more as you, especially when you get into the history brush. And this I got from print, W-A-N-D, wand, printwand.com. It's just a small example of when to use one versus the other. It's another thing to take a look at, pause the video, and look over it really well. I have a lot of things that I found that I agree with. and that go with the rest of these lessons. So the reason why we don't use Photoshop for design, among a bunch of other reasons, you can see it here if you go to this web address. I won't go into them all here, but just do a little Google search. This will, if you don't believe me. It's multi-page layouts, the layer system, editing fonts, versatility of InDesign to be able to accommodate all this stuff is what makes it the go-to product as opposed to Photoshop. And it's how it's built, it's how you use it, and it's how and it's what initial form it comes in. But if the output file matters, sometimes the output file has to be a vector, because they'll insist on it. Rarely ever the other way around. Although for usage, sometimes you have to have pixels. Whereas like a Facebook image, they won't accept vector. I'm pretty sure they don't accept vector. Or some of the more common uses, they ask you just to upload a certain image for this or an image for that. So that would be a case of, but that's something that Illustrator can output as well. Illustrator can output raster and vector, whereas Photoshop can only output raster. Although Photoshop now and CC can output vector, but it's not set up to do that. So the general idea with these videos is to watch them all the way through and in order. And there's a few that you might not get right away. I'd say watch them again and do research the second time around. Some of these tutorials are going to be how to do things, and you'll see it in the title, like how to restore a photo, how to I think we have one on how to clean up a face, like clean up the complexion. But just keep in mind you're going to learn the most if you put up with all of the lectures, including the ones that aren't how-tos, that are more geared towards learning the program's ins and outs. So it's a combination of definitely using it and learning about it. So if you just take a look at some of these lists, it's just a brief rundown of what it's for and what it's not again. And this is focusing just on Photoshop, saying what it isn't for, what it is for. It's not really comparing it between Illustrator or anything. And I don't even use InDesign for graphic design. I use it Adobe Illustrator, but that's neither here nor there. I would have to say, though, out of the three, Photoshop is the least ill-equipped for graphic design. And I bring this up again and again because you'll have a lot of clients, or if you do this for a living, you'll have a lot of people that will ask you to do graphic design in Photoshop, and they'll want the original PSD files and everything, and it's just really not worth it. Maybe for a first project, but just watch these videos. After the first 5 or 6, you'll start getting a better feel for it, and most of them won't be boring like this, so don't worry. But watch them and practice, and when you don't get something, make sure you go over it on the internet, look it up on the internet, look it up on Google, and you'll find a lot of good sites. But definitely study those lists I posted up and make sure you learn everything. Thanks for watching.